the European Union has been intent on controlling what we call the narrative. In other words, controlling what can and cannot be said, which goes back quite a long way. And this is not something that just happened recently. In the Digital Services Act, which was passed a couple of years ago, was really the culmination of a longer term process, which essentially meant that what they tried to do was to codify in law, holding big tech to account for what was said online. And what they were concerned about was what they called the rise of hate speech, disinformation, fake news, etc. And that's really the roots of it. And so the Democracy Shield is really a culmination in a number of different trends that have come together into a much more of a centralized, coherent strategy. There's different levels of evidence, and there's different levels of intervention and what happens in this, which is it's quite difficult to grasp that what they've put in place is an entire network of unaccountable, unelected organizations, institutions, including themselves. I'm talking now about the European Union Commission, who are unelected. They're not accountable to the electorate at all. And what they've done is they've created what I call a kind of a censorship operating system, whereby a big tech can be reported by NGOs that are self-appointed, that more often than not are receiving money from the EU for fact-checking or for instances of misinformation or hate speech. And under the Digital Services Act, there are a number of organizations that have been created, that what they call trusted flaggers. These are organizations that are given the authority to flag material to big tech, which they have to then take down almost immediately. And if they don't act upon these examples that are given by these trusted flaggers, they can face massive fines. Something like 8% of their global revenues can be. And if you look at the database that they've created, what's called the Transparency Database under the Digital Services Act, you will see on a weekly basis, almost on a daily basis, there are thousands of things being taken down, of which if you search for something like a category like hate speech, you will see again that there are hundreds and hundreds of these things being taken down almost on a daily basis. Because what I think the EU are really concerned about is not hate speech, but their real concern is free speech. Their real concern are voices that are raising opposition to the European project, that are criticizing some of the key initiatives of the European Union, like the Green Deal, like their stance on immigration, like their stance on nuclear energy, for example. And voices that are critical of this, are saying, we need to have a public debate about this. They are now branding these views as being disinformation, or indeed sometimes hate speech. If you look at the report that we wrote, in particular, if you look at the elections that in the recent period, in Romania, where an election was annulled on the basis of a claim that false accounts and bots, TikTok, saw a big increase in the attention for the populist candidate, Georgescu. And actually, in reality, as it subsequently has turned out, there is no evidence that pickup in TikTok posts around this were actually originated from Russia, or that Russian bots were behind it. In other words, it was like a manufactured scare that they used as an excuse to annul the first round of the elections, where Georgescu won the election. And what happened? They even then banned him from standing, and the candidate that won was the candidate that Brussels wanted. So they directly meddled in an election, got it annulled on false premises. They tried to do it in Moldova, and they succeeded as well, not with the TikTok story, but in intervening directly into that election. And of course, Moldova is quite different because they're not a member of the EU yet. And this is all done under the Digital Services Act, by the way. This is the point to understand. They tried to do it in Czechia, but that didn't work because in Czechia there was a number of organizations that were alive to this and countered a lot of the stuff that was said. It's obviously a very different country to Romania. But what we saw happening in Romania was what we would regard as the kind of Brussels playbook, that they create this fear, they create this threat based on no evidence, just based on hearsay, and so it's fairly obvious that they are intervening. And at the moment, the Hungarian election, which is really the big prize as far as the EU are concerned, because the thing that they would really like to happen in Hungary is they want to get rid of Orban, because he's the kind of the father figure. He's the rallying cry of the populist movements across Europe. And if they could get rid of Orban, that would be like a wet dream for them. Well, the thing to understand about the Democracy Shield is the way it's being presented is very different to what it actually is in practice. It's being presented as this centralized body. They're going to create this new body for resilience, with the democratic resilience, that's going to oversee elections and going to ensure that there's no foreign intervention. The Democracy Shield is being presented as a mechanism through which the EU is protecting democracy in Europe from external intervention and interference. So similarly to what we've just been discussing about Romania, there they said that there were Russian bots and Russians were intervening to try and influence the election. And the Democracy Shield is being presented as this mechanism that's there to shield European democracy from these external threats, be it Russian or Chinese or whatever. In reality, this shield is there to protect the Commission, which is unelected, from the electorate. That's really what the Democracy Shield is about. It's not about the threat from outside. The actual threat to democracy in the future comes from the European Union itself, comes from the Commission, who are willing to manipulate the truth in order to ensure that the populist opposition that's growing to the European Union as it's presently constituted is kept in check, is actually forced to fail. Well, in the case of Hungary, I think Orban is correct to point out the danger of intervention either by Ukraine or by the EU itself. And of course, as I've said, already explained, what he's really concerned about is that the EU are wanting to get rid of Orban, wanting to get rid of that populist movement by essentially delegitimizing the claims that are being made about the future. It's something like the Ukraine, which, by the way, is not written in stone anywhere as to what the position should be. Hungary has been quite clear about how it sees its strategic and security concerns for the future. And this is not something that is beyond debate. This is something that should be an open political, people have a different perspective on this. And the fact that everybody's trying to get him out because he is seen as the bottleneck for preventing the EU operating in the way that they want to with regard to Ukraine in terms of spending, in getting more and more embroiled in it. And I think that they will use every trick in the book and every dirty trick to try and undermine Orban in the eyes of ordinary Hungarians. Already that is attempting, I think, almost like future-proofing, that whatever happens in the election, that the argument that can run one way or the other. If Orban wins the election, they can claim that this is because he manipulated the polling districts, and if he loses it, then they can make the claim that they held us in check, that they were able, because of all the stuff that they exposed, that this was just desserts. The stakes are incredibly high here. This is really not just about for the Hungarian people, but for the future of Europe. When Trump was elected in America the first time, and when Brexit happened in the UK, And suddenly the elite woke up to the fact that there were many millions of people in Europe that didn't agree with them anymore. It didn't share their point of view, and they panicked. And so, so instead of, as you would expect, if you were a true Democrat, that would have been the impetus to really engage with that politically, to try and win that argument. Instead, they've used bureaucratic means to manipulate. Instead of having the debate, they've tried to outlaw the debate by bureaucratic mechanisms through the Digital Service Act, the European Media Freedom Act, the Artificial Intelligence Act. All these acts, when you put them all together, it's all about Brussels controlling from the top what's right, what's wrong, what can be said, what cannot be said, what's legitimate, what's illegitimate. Macron is part of that, is the very political elite I'm talking about. These are exactly where all of this is coming from. You talk about Pavel. Let me give you an even better example, and that was what happened with Elon Musk and Thierry Breton. Thierry Breton, who was the commissioner, the EU commissioner responsible for markets, and basically the driving force behind the Digital Services Act. Do you recall there was a moment where Musk exposed the fact that in the run-up to the 2024 European elections, Breton offered him a deal, essentially, that said that if they suppressed certain points of view, then the EU would not pursue any legal claims against X for infringing the Digital Services Act. You just think about that for a second. Here's the man who's responsible for the DSA. This is the most important, if you heard him speak, it's the most important, this is about freedom of expression. This is about basically offering a deal saying that if you suppress speech, we won't fine you for any infringements that might have occurred in the past. But Musk comes out and says, well, forget it. I'm not prepared to go along with that because I believe in free speech. What he also exposed was the fact that Facebook and Google also had the same conversation with Breton, but they didn't come out and say no. So during the 2024 elections, who knows what happened in reality in terms of what was suppressed on Facebook or on Google, search engines or whatever. They were, quite willing, that's remarkably quite willing to abrogate their own law, their own rule of law, in order to get what they wanted, which was basically that they didn't want populist views, populist parties to gain seats in the parliament, and that's what they tried to do. There you've got a great example again of them manipulating an election to try and get the right result. They will do anything to get what they think is the right thing, the right result, and forget about the very few checks and balances that exist within the members and the way the union operates. I think there's a fantastic degree of arrogance at the top of the EU. These people sincerely believe that they know what's best for everybody else. What you see happening in the EU is this complete elitist contempt for ordinary people. That the elite think that they know what's best. If anybody transgresses, anybody goes against what they think is there's no explanation other than the fact that they've been manipulated, that they are stupid, that they are impressionable, that they are vulnerable, that they are just basically idiots. Free speech is the most important thing we have, because we believe that everybody has the reason and the capacity to think and weigh up arguments and decide for themselves as to what their best interests are. And the EU don't believe that. But if this populist swing, this populist mood develops further, and there's every indication that it is, if you look at what's happening in Germany, if you look what's happening in other parts of Eastern Europe, if you look what's happened in particular in France, if elections there are can take place without there being this kind of interference, and in fact everybody ganging up against the populists, etc., you know, just which is what we've seen up until now. If there were a shift that occurred in one of these major countries, where, you know, one of these parties could actually win,